This is Professor Emily Mercuri, and today we are covering Chapter 1, Consumer Safety and Drug Regulations, in the text Essentials of Pharmacology for Health Professions, 9th edition. Anytime we start a new chapter, I will tell you the chapter objectives at the beginning of the lecture. If you find that you're unsure of where to focus your attention, go ahead and come back to these slides. They're going to give you a good idea of what may be on the test or what is the most significant for you to remember. So this first slide, we have chapter objectives 1 through 5. Upon completion of the chapter, the learner should be able to 1. Explain what is meant by drug standards. 2. Discuss the historical development of pharmacology. 3. Name the first drug law passed in the United States for consumer safety and give the year it was passed. 4. Summarize the provisions of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938 and its amendments. And 5, interpret what is meant by USP/NF objective. We will be going into all of these points. So if you don't know the abbreviations now, don't worry, we'll get there. Chapter objectives 2 of 2. Upon completion of this chapter, the learner should be able to 6. Summarize the provisions of the Controlled Substance Act of 1970. 7. Contrast the responsibilities of the FDA and the DEA. 8. Define orphan drug. 9. Define schedules of controlled substances and differentiate between C1 through C5 schedules. 10. State several responsibilities you have in administering medications as a direct result of the 3 major drug laws described in the chapter. This is a brief drug history, obviously not all-inclusive of every single discovery or every single type of medicine. I want you to keep in mind that Indigenous people from around the world have been using folk medicine for many, many, many years. And even though these aren't documented on our history here, that those things are valid and significant. And many of our current pharmacological treatments actually come from folk medicine derivatives and herbs. So from ancient Egypt, that's when we will have seen the earliest evidence of what we would call a precursor to modern pharmacology. From then to today, pharmacology has advanced how ailments are treated. So the first event here on your timeline is 16th century BE. The earliest documented pharmacologic examples are found recorded on papyri from ancient Egypt. So Egypt is kind of the birthplace of what we would consider modern pharmacology. In the 2nd century BCE, the earliest evidence of what we would call actual prescriptions, so folks with more knowledge prescribing something to others. In the 1st century BCE, the Greek physician Dioscorides writes the De Materia Medica, which is considered the most influential work in the history of Western pharmacology. And then jumping forward to 1885, these are names you may be more familiar with. Louis Pasteur developed the precursor to the rabies vaccine. Oswald Schmeidberg, known as the founder of modern pharmacology, published the Outline of Pharmacology. 1897 to 1899, aspirin was discovered and first marketed for use, still widely used today, especially as a preventative for heart attacks for high-risk individuals. In 1905, the German chemist Alfred Einhorn discovered Novocaine. Anyone familiar with Novocaine? Anyone get a lot of dental work done? So Novocaine is a precursor to other numbing agents. In 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act passed in the United States. In 1922, insulin was first used to treat diabetes. This was a very significant discovery. I highly encourage you, if you are interested in history and pharmacological history, look into some of these historic accounts of insulin. They used to have these hospitals where they would have all these folks just lined up in diabetic comas, not knowing how to treat them, many of them children. And when insulin was first discovered, they would go around and they were trialing it and they would inject it in these people and they would wake up from their comas. There have been a few different kind of enactments of this in either literature or modern film, but I think it's such a cool moment in history and something that, if you're a type 1 diabetic, you cannot survive without exogenous insulin. We'll talk about that later, but what an important discovery in our history. In 1928, Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin. So penicillin, one of the first antibiotics used, and we still use penicillin derivatives for many things today, as well as penicillin itself. In 1936, chemotherapy was first used to treat cancer. In 1937, over 100 people died in the United States of a sulfanilamide elixir, which led to the passage of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in 1938. Unfortunately, like many things in our history, it takes something negative happening to create a catalyst for change. But the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act helped to establish better regulations for pharmacological substances being prescribed. In 1953, Watson and Crick described the structure of DNA. In 1960, the first contraceptive pill, which is the same as birth control, was developed. And then in 1958 to 1960, the thalidomide crisis occurred. So thalidomide is a chiral drug, and what that means is that there is a mirror of it, chemically speaking, that you can't necessarily see. It's a chemistry term, and basically one side of the mirror has one effect, the other side of the mirror has another effect. So the molecule has this chiral agent to it. Unfortunately, thalidomide was prescribed to treat morning sickness, and approximately 10,000 babies were born with deformities from this. This led to the passage of a Drug Amendment Act establishing the Food and Drug Administration in 1962. So again, in 1938, the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. In 1962, the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, saying we need an actual agency to create oversight and regulation over this process of pharmacology. In 1969, ibuprofen was developed in Great Britain. In 1991, the FDA approved the first ever treatment for hepatitis C. In 2000, the first draft of the human genome is released to the public, which sets the stage for genetically targeted drugs. In 2017, Shingrix, the vaccine to treat shingles, was approved. And in 2020 to 2021, several vaccines developed in an attempt to mitigate the COVID-19 global pandemic. What it's not here on your slides because it's not yet up to date with the 9th edition is that we actually recently also I didn't personally, but there was a RSV vaccine that was actually developed. And this is huge because RSV is a respiratory virus that is absolutely critical and can be deadly, especially for young infants. And so this is a newer vaccine on the market, currently being given to pregnant women, infants, and the elderly and immunocompromised. So that's also a big development that has recently occurred. So knowledge check. Where was the first documented proof in the use of pharmacology? A, ancient Egypt. B, South Africa. C, India. D, Great Britain. So the answer is A. The first documented proof in the use of pharmacology was in ancient Egypt. So let's talk about drug laws. In the 1900s in the United States, many laws were passed with regard to the dispensing of drugs. We'll get into some of the specific laws you need to know in the slides to come. Drug standards were created, and these were set to assure consumers that they're getting what they pay for. What that means is that all preparations of a drug with the same name must be of uniform strength, quality, and purity. Drug preparations are also covered by drug laws. This means that drug companies must not add other active ingredients or varying amount of chemicals. Again, this goes to the standardization of making sure things are of the same quality, purity. There's no diluting agents. There's no ingredients in terms of non-active ingredients that are being added or changed in each pill. Drug laws also cover illegal or what we call illicit drugs. The lack of enforcement of drug standards on these type of drugs poses consumer danger. No controls on quality can lead to deaths from overdose. So in this case, we're talking about things like methamphetamines, cocaine, heroin. So these do not have any kind of federal or state oversight because they are illegal. And so there's no control on the quality, the purity. Many of you have heard of the fentanyl epidemic, the opioid crisis, things being laced with fentanyl that consumers didn't know were laced with fentanyl. So this kind of all plays into that illegal, illicit drug, the laws that try to help protect consumers from having dire outcomes because of consumption of these drugs. The three major acts we're going to talk about are the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, The 1938 Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that I mentioned previously, and amendments of that act that were enacted in 1951 and 1962, and the 1970 Controlled Substances Act. In 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act was the first attempt to establish consumer protection in drug and food manufacturing. This required drugs to meet minimal standards of strength, purity, and quality. It also demanded labeling for preparations containing dangerous ingredients. So if, for instance, there's a derivative of something that can cause cancer or can cause some sort of harm, this must be labeled clearly for the consumer so they know that they're taking it with a risk involved. This also established the United States Pharmacopoeia and the National Formulary, which is a database that has lists of all the types of drugs that are available and the formulation of them, the side effects, kind of an overview of everything that can be used as a guide for anyone who's prescribing, as well as for the consumer. In 1938, the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was passed, and because of this act, the FDA was established under the Department of Health and Human Services. This established more specific regulations for preventing adulteration of, meaning tampering with, drugs, foods, and cosmetics. One example would be warning labels that may be present on certain preparations. I highly recommend if you have medications at home, whether they're prescription, over the counter, look at the labels, see if you can find any of these things. Some labels include may cause drowsiness, may cause nervousness, maybe habit forming, those types of things. So the FDA really gets to act as a regulatory agency to ensure that safety standards are met. Other things covered by the establishment of the FDA include all labels being accurate. All labels must include a listing of all active and inactive ingredients. On the next slide, we will look at some medication labels and we'll kind of go over what that looks like. All new products must also be approved by the FDA before public release. So they need to go through trials, they need to go through rigorous testing. As I stated before, warning labels must be present on certain preparations. And then certain drugs must be labeled with the legend or key that says, federal laws prohibits dispensing without a prescription. So this will let users know that this is not okay if you're taking this drug. If you're taking this without a prescription, it's unsafe. You should not be taking any drugs that were prescribed to somebody else for personal use. Prescription and non-prescription drugs must be shown to be effective as well as safe for them to be put on the market. And then in 1972, the National Drug Code Directory was established. This provided the FDA with a list of all the drugs manufactured for commercial distribution. And then each drug has a unique NDC number made up of 3 parts. What that means is the first part has 5 numbers, identifies the manufacturer. The second part has 4 numbers and identifies the drug. And the third part is 2 digits and identifies the package size. And so this helps to kind of standardize, and if you're looking at a bottle, they can go straight from the numbers. They have this whole National Drug Code Directory, and that helps to make sure that everything that is being used and is being given out or sold in the United States is within that directory. This is an example of a medication label. So on the front, you'll see the expiration date at the very top. Underneath, you'll have the product name, in this case, aspirin. Underneath that, you will have the product dose, 81 milligrams. And then just to be very clear, underneath that, it will have the net quantity of contents. So that means how many are in the bottle and how many milligrams per each. So for this, it says 400 tablets at 81 milligrams each. Underneath that, it has the name and address of the manufacturer. On the backside, it's going to have a list of active ingredients, in this case, aspirin. Underneath, the indication for use. Why are you using this medication? Underneath that, warning and cautionary statements, allergy alert, alcohol warning if pertinent, if it's recommended or not recommended during pregnancy, and then keeping out of reach of children. So for this one, it has all of those because they're all pertinent to this medication. Underneath that, it has directions and dosage instructions, how to take it, and then at the end it has other information that might have to do with temperature regulation, please use by expiration date, tamper-resistant feature. So most medications, as you know, have some kind of safety seal on them, and so you don't want to use it if there is any evidence that it may have been tampered with. In 1970, the Controlled Substances Act came about, and this established the Drug Enforcement Administration, which is the DEA. This set tighter controls on a specific group of drugs, specifically those that were being abused by society. Some examples include depressants, stimulants, psychedelics, narcotics, and anabolic steroids. So I'm sure you can think of things in many of those categories. Some that readily come to mind are things like Adderall. Used for ADHD appropriately, it's prescribed, but it can also be used as a stimulant. It can be abused in that way. Psychedelics, something like ketamine comes to mind. Narcotics, think about opioids like Norco, hydrocodone, those kind of things. They were seeing that there was a big misuse of these and that they were being abused as a whole by society. So the Drug Enforcement Administration provided guidelines for 5 schedules of controlled substances, and that is designated by a capital C. So if a substance is controlled, it will have a C1, C2, C3, C4, or C5 label, and you'll see on the PowerPoint, those are Roman numerals. So you're not going to see the number 3, you'll see 3 straight lines for 3. So just take a look at that, and you can refer to Table 1.1 in your text if you want more examples of that. In 1983, the Orphan Drug Act was passed, and this gives financial incentives to develop medications for diseases that affect a small number of people and are of low profitability. So what all of that means and why do we care? There are diseases that are rare, and drug companies historically don't want to create drugs that they're not going to get a bunch of money from. Unfortunately, we live in a capitalist society. This is the way that things go. And so you think about things like sickle cell anemia, let's say. I had a friend who recently passed away from sickle cell, devastating, but it does affect a smaller number of people. And so the Orphan Drug Act, it gave incentive and financial backing so that companies were actually creating drugs for those types of diseases, which is a great thing. The Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, OBRA of 1990, it covers a lot of different things, and I talk about this in our CNA course as well. But what it does in regards to pharmacology is it mandates that over-the-counter, you'll see OTC as the abbreviation for over-the-counter. Over-the-counter drugs must be documented as part of a medical record. And so if a patient comes in, let's say to the hospital, I actually work in the emergency department, and so I do ask them what prescriptions they're taking, and then I ask what their home medications are that are over the counter. Things like, are they taking ibuprofen? Are they taking supplements? Why does that matter? Because those actually can have drug interactions with prescription medications, and if I don't know what they're on, we could cause harm to the patient. Pharmacists must provide drug use review and patient counseling, meaning when you get a new prescription prescribed and you go into the pharmacy, the pharmacist is supposed to always provide how we use this drug, what do you need to know about this drug, what you need to be careful of with the other drugs that you're taking, and so that is always provided to you, especially with a new medication. So let's do a knowledge check. Which of the following ensures that consumers get what they pay for? A, the Federal Drug Administration, B, the Drug Enforcement Agency, C, drug standards, D, the Pure Food and Drug Act. The answer is C, drug standards. So remember that drug standards just means consumers get what they pay for. We are regulating for purity, we are regulating for standards, and then the other answers, options listed, had more to do with specifics and or regulatory agencies. Knowledge check. What year was the first drug law passed for consumer safety in the United States? A, 1938, B, 1971, C, 1906, D, 1908. The answer is C, 1906. Another knowledge check. The 1938 Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and the amendments to the act established which of the following? A, Prescription and non-prescription drugs must show they are effective. B. Warning labels must be placed on certain preparations. C. All labels must include all active ingredients. D. All of these. And the answer is D. All of these. Another knowledge check for us. The United States Pharmacopoeia National Formulary is a reference: A. For marketing drugs from every country. B. For requiring labeling on only non-controlled substances. C. For approved drugs. Or D. For over-the-counter drugs. The answer is C, for approved drugs. So the United States Pharmacopoeia, remember, it's a reference specifically for the United States for approved drugs under the FDA. Unfortunately, it is very hard to come across a worldwide formulary for drugs, and the reason being is that different regulating agencies oversee different countries. And so let's say, for example, I have a patient who is from India and they come to the hospital and they need certain medications. Their medications that are prescribed there are not going to be exactly the same formulations as here. And so I'm left trying to find, well, which one is the closest? How do we get them the care that they need without being able to get access to the medications that they can get in their home country? So that is something that, unfortunately, there is no kind of standardization of at this time. Another knowledge check. Which act provided enforcement of controlling the use of addictive medication by requiring restrictions and accountability? A. The 1938 Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. B. The 1970 Controlled Substances Act. C. The 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act. Or D. The 1970 Controlled Substances Act. And for some reason, B and D are the same answer. And it also happens to be the correct answer. So 1970, the Controlled Substances Act. Which act provides funding for pharmaceutical companies to develop medications to treat diseases that affect only a small number of people? A. The 1970 Controlled Substance Act. B. The Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, OBRA, of 1990. C. The 1983 Orphan Drug Act. Or D. The 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act. The answer is C. The 1983 Orphan Drug Act. Think of orphan drugs as abandoned drugs. Companies didn't want to put money into them because they were poor and abandoned. It's kind of bad to say, but that's how I kind of have it stick in my mind with Orphan Drug Act. And that helped to make sure that medications and drugs were created for rare diseases. Which is a legal limitation for a C2 drug, so a controlled substance? A. No refills without a new written prescription. B. May be refilled up to 5 times in 6 months. C. Not approved for medical use in the United States. Or D. May lead to moderate dependence. The answer is A. No refills without a new written prescription. Yes, some of them can lead to addiction and those type of things, but that is not a legal limitation. We want to think about what is important for prescribers to know, what is important for consumers to know. So when these drugs are dispensed, they are dispensed in small quantities. If someone comes, let's say, to my emergency department and they get a prescription for Norco, we can only write them usually between 6 and 10 total pills, and then they have to follow up with the primary care doctor to get a further prescription, because we are not going to just give them 30 pills with 5 refills on something that's controlled. Let's talk a little bit more about the Federal Drug Administration, the FDA, and what they do. So the FDA oversees testing of all proposed new drugs before they're released into the U.S. market. They also inspect manufacturing plants where foods, drugs, medical devices, or cosmetics are made. So it ensures that these plants are held to a standard of purity, efficacy. Are there clean conditions? Are the workers there treated appropriately? Are people coming to work sick and contaminating things? So those types of things. They review new drug applications and petitions for food additives. Is this safe to use in our food? I know some of you probably recently saw that they are banning red dye. I think it's number 3. And so that's important that we are constantly inspecting what is being added to our food that might cause harm. They investigate and remove unsafe drugs from the market. They ensure proper labeling of foods, cosmetics, and drugs for consumer use. The DEA, in contrast, the Drug Enforcement Administration, they're concerned only with controlled substances. So I want you to hear drug enforcement. Think of that like law enforcement. So controlled substances, substances that may be more at risk for abuse. They enforce the laws against drug activities, including illegal drug use, dealing, and manufacturing. So they're going to go after and prosecute for illegal drug use. And they monitor the need to change the schedules of abused drugs. Is this drug actually worse than we had initially thought? Is it more addictive? Does it need to move from a C2 to C3, that kind of thing? So they are constantly monitoring the need for changing the schedules of abused drugs. And this is going to vary again from state to state because certain states, for example, medical marijuana is legal as opposed to other states. So they are kind of overseeing all of that and what is considered illegal drug use. Which is a responsibility of the Drug Enforcement Agency? A, reviewing new drug applications and petitions for food additives. B, monitoring the need for changing the schedules of abused drugs. C, inspecting plants where food, drugs, medical devices, or cosmetics are made. And D, ensuring proper labeling of food, cosmetics, and drugs. So the answer is B. They monitor the need for changing the schedules of abused drugs. All of those other answers are the FDA, not the DEA. When we talk about healthcare professionals, we have to talk about law and ethics. As healthcare professionals, we must act ethically when ordering and dispensing medications to patients. As a nurse, I am not ordering, meaning I'm not prescribing medication, but I am dispensing or giving medication to patients. So we have the responsibility of keeping accurate records of the medications dispensed and maintaining supplies of drugs at the facility in which we're caring for patients, whether that's a pharmacy, hospital, doctor's office, etc. In addition, the following guidelines should be followed by all healthcare professionals when dispensing medication. A, have a current drug reference source readily available at all times. If you're working in a facility such as a hospital, there is a drug reference text linked to your medical administration record, so you can click on it and you can see what the current guidelines are for that drug. In general, if you are not familiar with a drug, you should not be giving it. You need to take a minute to familiarize yourself and make sure that it is safe. And so one example of that, my sister is an oncology nurse. She gives a lot of chemotherapy and chemo drugs. If a patient came into my hospital and needed a chemotherapy agent administered, especially a specific one, in the emergency department, I don't really deal with chemotherapy all that often. So if that was ordered, I would take a few minutes, look up the drug reference source, and make sure I felt comfortable with the side effects, what to look out for, make sure the patient's well educated before I go ahead and give that medication. You must also keep controlled substances locked securely or double locked, meaning drugs must be in a locked safety box. In a hospital setting, it's something that it's called different things depending on where you are, but ours is called a Pyxis, and it's a dispensing machine. So I have to type in the patient's information, all those things, and the prescription has to be in, and I have to click on it before I can even get the medication given to me. That may look different depending on what type of facility you're working at. Placing the locked box in a cupboard that's also locked if that's pertinent. And so sometimes in places like skilled nursing or long-term care, they have like a big cart that has a locked overall box, and then each drawer might be locked for specific more controlled substances. Conceal and secure prescription pads at your office, clinic, or facility. Written prescription pads are kind of becoming a thing of the past, but that is like a notepad that's prescription paper where the doctor can write a prescription by hand. If you had that, let's say just sitting on your desk as a doctor, what's to stop anybody from walking in, stealing that, writing themselves prescription for controlled substances? And so if you are still using those old school kind of prescription pads, then those need to be hidden and locked away. And then keep accurate records of each controlled substance administered, received, or destroyed at your facility for up to 2 years. So this is a big deal. Facilities must keep records for at least 2 years of controlled substances. And if I have to waste a substance, let's say I pull a narcotic and the patient doesn't want it, but I already opened the package, I have to have a second person go into the system and watch me waste that and witness that they watch me waste that, because it's very important that these are not being abused. We're also responsible for keeping up to date with current news of the activities of the FDA and DEA. You want to know what is currently going on, what is in the works, what is in legislation, and keep yourself informed. Local pharmacists are great resources. It's important to establish a working rapport if you're a healthcare professional. If you need further insight, I oftentimes will call a pharmacist at my facility. Hey, the patient has some questions about this drug and it's a newer drug for me. Can you give me some information? If you work in an office, maintain a professional rapport with the pharmaceutical representatives who leave drug samples. So pharmaceutical representatives will come in and they will say, hey, we're trialing this drug. We'd like your office to consider using it, those kind of things. It's good to keep professional rapport, honestly, with everyone within the interdisciplinary team, but just to know that you have those kind of resources available to you. While establishing professional rapport with the pharmaceutical representative, though, it is equally important to be aware of an ethical dilemma that may occur when given gifts, rewards, or confiscated for prescribing certain medications. So there is an act called the Sunshine Act that requires reporting on compensation and gifts paid to physicians by pharmaceutical representatives. So again, it's a business. If a company is developing a new drug, and they come, and actually I'm a supervisor in the ER, so this does occur where they will say, hey, can we come talk to you about this new drug? And, we'll bring the whole staff donuts. Okay, well, that's kind of a compensation or a gift in a minor way. But if they were saying, hey, every time you prescribe this, we're going to pay you $15 on the side, that is not legal, and that's not something that they are allowed to do per the Sunshine Act. But sometimes it's for me, I'm like, oh, this actually sounds great. This would be a great medication for many of our patient population. Let me bring that to the provider team. Let me talk to the doctors and see what they think. And that is kind of par for the course versus them trying to somehow incentivize me for getting the doctors to prescribe it. Just to kind of clear what that looks like. All right, one more knowledge check for this chapter. Healthcare professionals are responsible for following which guideline related to medications? A, keep controlled substances locked securely. B, keep a current drug reference source available. C, keep accurate records of all controlled substances administered, received, or destroyed at your facility. D, all of these. And the answer is D, all of these. At the end of every PowerPoint, I want you to look at this self-assessment tool, and this is a way to guide you for further studying. So question 1, what can you do to help improve your knowledge and understanding of the 5 schedules of controlled substances? 2, which misconceptions and facts about drug therapy and facts about drugs did you find most surprising or interesting? And 3, how do the medication labels shown in the chapter satisfy the requirements of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938 and its amendments? Again, this was Chapter 1 of Essentials of Pharmacology for Health Professions, 9th edition. Thank you.